Hi, and thanks for joining us for this episode of It's Your History. I'm your host, Matt Overstreet. You know, we love to take a look at history on this show, especially the history of Anoka County, but it would be absolutely impossible to do so without the science of archaeology. Well, that's just what we're going to look at in this episode, so sit back, grab your whip and your fedora as we take a look at archaeology in Anoka County on this episode of It's Your History. The executive director of the Anoka County Historical Society, Ebnet-Mavencamp, gets a chance to sit down and talk to Jeremy Nienow, a PhD in anthropology and an archaeologist, and he tells us all about archaeology in Anoka County.
I'm Rebecca, and today we're taking a look at archaeology in Anoka County. It's been a long history of finding things in the ground that started back in the 1920s. And here to talk more about that is Jeremy Nienow, a consultant that's working with us on a grant that's funded through the Legacy Funds. We're partnering with Anoka County, Ramsey County, Scott County, and Dakota County. So Jeremy, if you could tell us a little bit more about the history of archaeology in general and define the term for people a little bit more.
Sure. Archaeology is a subfield within anthropology. Anthropology is the study of humanity. So archaeology is the study of humanity looking specifically at remains and material culture in the past. So we're looking at everyday objects. You might think of them as artifacts. That's what people call them. A lot of people used to consider archaeology to be more along Indiana Jones, thinking about distant temples and relics and that nature, but really archaeology, the artifacts that we collect and examine today are really everyday objects that people used in the past, beginning here in Minnesota about 12,000 years ago up until really the 1950s.
So oftentimes you hear of farmers turning up arrowheads or other pottery shards in their fields. What process would they go through then to start preserving those? Sure,
well actually farmers, I think, are some of the best avocational archaeologists we have today. They certainly hold a wellspring of information. They've been on the landscape for a very long time, and they're usually the first individuals we come to if we're going to be doing some work because they've been collecting their whole lives, or they're now their second or third generation farmers in areas, 100-year farms. And usually they'll be plowing along or walking a field. They'll find some remnant or evidence of the past, and they'll put it in a shoebox, and they'll forget about it. And then their kids will find them. And then as grandpa or grandma gets older and they pass things on, they start to lose the story of where those objects came from. Oh, I remember exactly in the field where that came from. So we really encourage individuals when they do find things, first of all, it's their private property, so the objects belong to them, as long as you're not in an area that's a burial mound or another protected archaeological site. If it's just your field, those objects belong to you, just like if things were found nearby your house, it's the same process, you own that property. But you can still contact the state archaeologist and you can document, photograph and maybe put on a map or write down on a piece of paper where they came from and keep that with the objects. That's one of the most important things you do, because once you pass those things on to the next generation, you really had an interest in them, you pass them on to the next kid, he's 6 or 7 years old and he remembers this story, but then the objects lose exactly where they came from, and suddenly when he talks to somebody, oh, I have these artifacts, and where do they come from? Well, they came from Grandpa's field. Well, which field? I don't remember. When that happens, we lose that connection to place. Mm-hmm. And that's really one of the things that archaeology does as a whole. It's why it's so evocative as a field, is because it gives people a real connection not only to the past, but also a connection to place and a sense of space in their community. So really having that exact location as best as they can remember is a key thing. A lot of times developers, when they're doing new projects and they come across archaeological areas, will just not put a house on that spot. They'll put some green space, maybe they'll dedicate it to part of, on the edge of a wetland area. You can document spaces a lot through photography, mapping, ground penetrating radar, which is something that can be done as well to document these things, and before development happens. And that's a very important thing to consider, that even with federal law protecting archaeological sites and getting us to recognize and think about archaeological sites, it still doesn't stop development from happening. And the process that was laid out in this law that happened in the 1960s, the National Historic Preservation Act, has a sort of three-step process of identification, evaluating whether or not that site is important, and if that site is important and a portion of it cannot be preserved, to mitigate the impact to that site. So excavation ahead of development. So it doesn't stop development, it merely tries to work within that development to find out what we can about the past before that development happens. We don't want to stop progress from occurring. We want people to live in these areas and appreciate them just as much as people have in the past, but we really want to make sure that they continue to have that connection to the past. And I'm pretty sure we'll always continue to do that. Being able to visit your local historical society, being able to have those stories that are passed down from generation to generation really keeps us connected to where we are. And we've been telling these stories for generations.
And we will continue to do so. So Jeremy, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate having you on the show.
Absolutely.
Certainly a lot more goes into the archaeology in Anoka County than we would think. Coming up next, we're going to get a chance to hear from Scott Anfinson, who is the Minnesota State Archeologist, coming up next on It's Your History.
If you're looking for local sports coverage, check out In the Game right here on QCTV and QCTV.org. On In the Game, we cover sports stories, both high school and amateur sports, from our 4 local cities here in Andover, Anoka, Champlin, and Ramsey. Some of the stories and interviews will give you insight into what happens here in the sports landscape of our cities. So check out In the Game with me, Chris Carpenter, right here on QCTV and QCTV.org.
Archaeologically speaking, nothing happens in the state without the say of Scott Anfinson, the state archaeologist. Up next, he's going to let us know all about the history of archaeology in the state, as well as in Anoka County.
My name's Scott Anfinson. I'm the state archaeologist for Minnesota, and I've been the state archaeologist for about 10 years now. I took the job in 2006. I'm the 4th state archaeologist that has served in Minnesota. That became a very difficult part of my job, is dealing with all the burial sites. Burials are emotional, they're complicated, no 2 burial sites are alike. But I found out that if you really make a serious effort and a concerted effort to consult with Indian communities and the Indian Affairs Council, actually I've had a pretty good run in dealing with all these burial issues, although they still are not fun and they still are very, very difficult. So that's one of my original duties, were really to sort of lead education and lead research in the state and license archaeologists to work on non-federal public land in Minnesota. But when they added on that burial site duty in 1978, that really has taken up. It probably takes up a third of my time now dealing with burial sites, and it's still a difficult part of my job. But that said, I basically have 3 main parts to my mission. And one is to lead research in the state, and I've been incredibly lucky to have gotten the legacy amendment being passed during my tenure, because that has provided money to actually do archaeological research, and that's been absolutely wonderful for me to have to deal with that. So I try lead research in the state. Secondly, I try share the knowledge we get from archaeology and do education, and that's a part we're really starting to expand on, and I feel guilty that I haven't done more on that. But we are launching a new web page now for the state archaeologists that should help with the educational component. The third component is to protect archaeological sites, and that's not just those Indian burial sites or those early cemetery sites from early settlers in Minnesota. It's any kind of archaeological site that's important. So protecting sites is a big part of what I do, and the primary way I do that is through what we call the environmental review process. So I get to review, one of the things I do is review environmental assessment worksheets that are sent out. When projects get so big and they can pollute so much, they have to do an environmental assessment worksheet. And on these worksheets, I get copies of them, and I can say, there's a question on there that says, are there going to be any historical or archaeological sites impacted by this undertaking? And I can reply back saying, well, we don't know of a site there, but I think it's got high potential and you should survey it. Because the majority of archaeological sites in the state are not known. We know the locations of almost 20,000 archaeological sites in Minnesota, but just a conservative estimate would say there's probably 1 million archaeological sites in Minnesota. So we've really only got about 1% or so of the sites known. So a lot of it is predicting where something will occur. So that's a big part of my job, is to actually protect archaeological sites through the environmental review process. Now when we do these, all these surveys and everything, the greatest failing of modern archaeology is the public doesn't get to find out about this. And that's really a big failing. So what I get all the time are, like for Anoka County, I get reports all the time for Anoka County. Here's a big site that was excavated in Anoka County. It's in a contract completion report that's sent to me and sent to the Historical Society and sent to the agency who sponsored the work. They get buried in file cabinets in my office, and the public never gets to know about them. So very little has been published out there with regard to archaeology that's been done in Anoka County or anywhere in Minnesota. I started thinking this morning, well, what's been published in Anoka County? The only thing that I could think of recently was there was a little, the Minnesota Archeologist is a publication in Minnesota that's done both for professionals and the avocational community. And there was an article by Dan Wendt, who's been one of our great contributors from Anoka County. Dan published a little archaeological article on some lithic materials, some stone materials he found in Anoka County. Very little else has ever been published on Anoka County. And if you look at a map of Anoka County, this is our record of where all the sites are. So you can see the sites. So there seems to be a couple of concentrations. You can see along the Mississippi River in the southwestern part of the county, and in the Lake District to the north a little bit, some of the big lakes up there. But then you see some bands that go through here. Sometimes those bands are due to ancient choices. Sometimes they're due to modern choices. So sometimes you can follow the route of a pipeline through a county because they surveyed the pipeline, because the federal government made them survey that pipeline. So you'll find a nice line and say, oh, that's a pipeline coming through. Other times you find something like this, and this is the chain of lakes down in the southeastern part of the county that's connected by Rice Creek. And lots of sites are known along there, both burial mounds and habitation sites. And that's where a number of years ago, the Institute for Minnesota Archeology started looking at some of the sites in that area and have some wonderful collections that are now homeless, basically, sitting here in our office at the State Archeologist's office. Anoka County is a good place to live today. It was a great place to live in the past, and I think we've got to do some more research on that whole Rice Creek chain of lakes. We know where lots of sites are. Archaeologists have tested a lot of these sites, but no one's ever sat down and put it all together and said, here's what's going on in the Rice Creek chain of lakes in Anoka County, so we can better understand the past. If we don't share what we have with peers, with other archaeologists, and with the public, all of our work in the end is worthless because it has to be public knowledge. So that's something I'm hoping I say that my successor can have more success with. So So it's great to be able to talk to you today. I hope you learned something about archaeology, and I hope you can learn something about the archaeology of Anoka County in the coming years.
Those were certainly some amazing artifacts to check out, and we got to thank Scott Anfinson for letting us be there to see him. Coming up next, Jeremy Nienow is going to tell us all about how funding for archaeology in Minnesota is procured. Up next on It's Your History.
What I like about QCTV is that I can watch local programming even when I'm away at school in Boston. I just go to QCTV.org and I can find out what is happening in Anoka, Andover, Ramsey, and Champlin. This summer, I will get to see local graduations, parades, and community events. Thanks, QCTV! Want to know what is going on in your city hall? Watch News and Views. Catherine, Corey, Noah, Matt, and Leslie will keep you informed and up to date on city activities. I hope you're enjoying our local programming right here on QCTV.
In this next segment, we get a chance to hear from Jeremy Nienow, who has a PhD in anthropology and is an archaeologist. And he's going to tell us how the Legacy Amendment is able to procure funds so that he can continue his work.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Nienow. I'm standing here in the archaeological labs for the Minnesota Historical Society out at Fort Snelling. And I want to talk a little bit today about the grant that Anoka County is participating in through the Legacy Amendment, and also the collections that Scott Anfinson had talked about before. The grant that Anoka County and Scott and Dakota County and Ramsey County have all been working on through the Legacy Amendment is really an archaeological liaison program designed to give them the opportunity to not only look at their archaeological collections and do public programming, but also then to do some science around the archaeology that's in their county. Scott Anfinson earlier in an interview had talked about the importance of letting the public know what kind of archaeology had been done in Anoka County, and the fact that only a small handful of all the archaeological sites had had anything produced for the public. He also talked about the Institute of Minnesota Archaeology, a large private nonprofit that had been set up to do archaeological work through the 1980s and 1990s, and when that organization folded, their collections ended up here under the auspices of the Office of the State Archeologist, but they're being housed here in MHS's archaeology lab. One of those sites that he talked about specifically was 21AN20, which is a large multi-component archaeological site that has woodland materials from the middle woodland, transitional woodland up through the Oneota, so it's really about 2,000 years of archaeological information and cultural history. The site was excavated in the 1980s, late 1980s, and the collections are here. Again, the State Archeologist has them. And these collections, which have thousands and thousands of artifacts, just opening up the page here to look at the pottery, they have a huge amount of scientific data that could be done, research that could be done on those. For example, we have here some potsherds that came from just one of the more than 40 excavation units that were excavated out there. These potsherds still have remnants of the things that were cooked in them. So you can learn through phytolith analysis, which is looking at the cell structures, the silica glass cell structures of plants. You can determine what kind of plants were eaten. You can get pollen and starch residues from them and figure out the animals and proteins that were done. You can also archaeologically date and figure out how old the site is. We also have carbon from the site, from plants that were, and wood that was burned. You can figure out the types of plants that they're burning, the types of wood that they're burning, how old the site is. And they also have all kinds of other scientific materials, including macrofloral analysis materials from flotation that was done, as well as all of the projectile points and other kinds of materials that are from this one site. And this is just one of more than a dozen archaeological sites from Anoka County that's available for scientific research right now, and that we're going to be able to do some projects around. So the grant for the Legacy Amendment is going to help Anoka County not only to be able to do carbon-14 analysis, phytolith analysis, but also X-ray fluorescence to look at clay and clay types to see if people were actually making clays, making pots with local clay materials, or if they were getting these materials from outside of the county. We can start to learn about trade, understand marriage patterns, status, ethnicity, all those different pieces from this one grant. So not only does the grant helping us to get out to the public, go to Linwood Family Fest, or go to the Now Then Threshing Show and see some of these great opportunities to teach people about archaeology, but it's also letting us do hard science and really contribute to the research potential, not only for these archaeological sites, but really for all the sites in Anoka County and how they relate to the state as a whole.
It was certainly great hearing from Jeremy and learning all about how they procure those funds. Well, coming up next, we're going to hear from someone in the know from the Anoka County Board all about how modern development can affect archaeology in the county. Coming up next on It's Your History.
I finally got diagnosed with schizophrenia when I was 17, when I was in the 11th grade. My symptoms include auditory hallucinations, paranoia, religious delusions, and seeing things. It's not scary, it's not weird, it's been happening ever since as long as I can remember. People only pay attention to the stigma or the bad reputation of having a mental illness, but what they don't realize is that people with mental illnesses are still people. I work as a mix-sound engineer. I run my own facility in downtown Minneapolis. All I do is work with music, either recording, mixing, or mastering, and that's my only source of income right now, and I'm doing it. A success story is someone that is self-sufficient and independent, and I am very much a success story.
When any county is surveying for potential development, one thing that they can run afoul of is a potential archaeological site. Next, we're going to hear from Rhonda Siverajah, the Anoka County Board Chair, and hear all about how development can potentially be impeded by archaeology.
So we're here today with Rhonda Siverajah, the Anoka County Board Chair, and she will be speaking to us from the county perspective of archaeology and how that impacts the county in financial ways as well as some other emotional ways for future projects. So Rhonda, welcome. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
If you could first start out with telling us a little bit about the state and federal regulations that you have to work under as a county.
Sure, well, it mainly falls within our highway department and our parks department, in that any time that we are doing a project where we have state or federal dollars, there are certain requirements. And along with that, at the state level, generally they'll identify if there is historic or archaeological impacts that could take place as part of a particular project.
So in the case of the Wargo Nature Center, how does one identify a site that's already existing to be retroactively looked at by these tests?
Well, because that is an area that is rich with a lot of cultural aspects, it has been identified by the state as an area that when we work there is impacted, even though there's been a lot of work done there already. And so I think that that really does become the challenge, where I think that when things have maybe already been identified in that area, those things are certainly preserved. But where there's already been significant site development, the chances that you're going to find something in those exact sites where there's already been significant development are really pretty slim.
Does the county have any control over adding sites to be looked at, or is it strictly state and federal recommendation?
It's based on the state and federal recommendations, and they work very closely with the Minnesota Historical Society. Within MnDOT itself, they have a cultural resources unit, so they work very closely with those areas. But there are things that happen. I believe it was sometime last year up in Crow Wing County, they had a highway project that they were working on, and as part of the process ended up identifying artifacts that were over 2,000 years old. So even though sometimes we feel as though there's been so much time that's gone by and maybe there isn't a lot left there, clearly that was a situation where the law that was in place really made a difference to make sure that some of those things were protected.
What other projects are currently happening throughout the county that may be impacted by these state and federal regulations?
One of the things that I can think of that really is not a parks department and not a highway department, but we are working with Common Cause and looking at some of the buildings out at the old, it was called the State Hospital at one point in time, the Regional Treatment Center area, a couple of the buildings out there, and are working with Common Bond to apply for grants to have some of them refurbished and made into housing specifically for veterans. And that will be a way to be able to maintain those buildings on that campus, but yet to make them usable for, I think, a really great cause.
And so how does that tie in with the archaeological needs?
It ties in that the National Historic Registry will also be involved as part of putting it on the Historic Registry. Also opens up the possibility for additional grant dollars to come in as far as preservation goes. So those are some of the things that Common Bond is looking at in order to be able to deliver the project, similar to some of the work that was done at Fort Snelling with some of the housing there.
Thank you again so much for your time, Rhonda.
Thank you again for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
More coming up next on It's Your History.
Hello, I'm James Stewart, Sheriff of Anoka County, and I'd like to invite you to watch The Sheriff Show on QCTV. On the show, we feature various divisions within our office, including Patrol, K-9, SWAT, community events, the dive teams, and much more. So tune into The Sheriff Show on your local channel 15 and 16 and keep up to date on what's happening at the Anoka County Sheriff's Office.
Archaeology in Anoka County isn't something that we're always consciously aware of, but whether we're aware of it or not, it is something that's always taking place. And thanks to funds from the Legacy Amendment, we can be sure that the history of our county will continue to be explored. Thanks again for watching this episode of It's Your History. For QCTV, I'm Matt Overstreet.